Hi everyone, and welcome to the TÜV Consumer Products and Retail webinar on the US regulations for the micro unmanned aircraft systems. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Simon Middleton, and I'll go through some of the basic information before we kick off the presentation by our speakers, Jeffrey Jakumin and Asli Solma-Kaiser. Our speakers today are Jeffrey, as I said earlier on, from TÜV. He is the Senior Technology and Regulatory Affairs Expert for Electrical and Electronics of TÜV, and he has over 30 years of verified successes in global electronics and high-volume manufacturing. We're also lucky enough today to have Asli, who is the Vice President and Global Head of Electrical and Electronics at TÜV. And Asli has over 10 years of experience in the TIC industry and has served in various senior business development positions. She holds a BA degree in Business Administration from Istanbul University and an MBA degree with the University of Mannheim. Without further ado, I will now hand over the presentation to Asli, who will give a brief introduction and take you through some of the topics. Asli, I'll pass it over to you. Hello, Asli.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So we'll, first of all, thank you very much for joining this webinar. And before we go into the details, we just would like to familiarize you with some acronyms that we are using during the webinar. So when we talk about UAV, UAS, RPAS, remotely piloted aircraft system, or drones, basically we are always talking about the unmanned aircraft vehicles or drones, so we are talking about the same thing, so do not get confused if you see different acronyms at different places. AIS stands for Abbreviated Injury Scale, and PIS for Remote Pilot in Command. Market size. The market size for drones from 2014, it was about 15 million US dollars, but for 2020, it's expected to grow over 5 billion US dollars. So this is really a tremendous increase of the market. It's coming, of course, from one side, we are looking at the toys, smaller drones, consumer drones, hobby vehicles. From the other side, we are looking at really larger vehicles that go beyond the line of sight and are really acting more like air freight vehicles. So what is happening in the regulatory environment? What we see is that there is because of the accidents, many accidents that are happening in the market, drones crashing with aircraft, drones flying over people. The different authorities, and in many cases the aviation authorities, feel the need to regulate this environment, so that in order to protect, from one side, in order to protect the industry, the sustainable growth, and from the other side, in order to protect the environment and the people. And so far, the different countries are building different regulations. And even in US, you can see different states coming up with different requirements for drones. In one country, you can see something, for instance, a drone being treated like a toy, whereas in the other country, you can see it being treated like a consumer, different consumer product. So the approach that the different countries are taking are through categorization. So they will say, okay, this is the, let's say, the toy category, this is the consumer category, this is the commercial category. So depending on the weight or depending on the joules, so the impact, or depending on the level of injury the product could cause, there's going to be a different categorization. And depending on this categorization, of course, the regulations are going to change. And the interesting thing is that this categorization is different from one country to the other country. So this is actually an example of what we are seeing for for drones in consumer area. So we have the different regulations regarding the electrical safety, battery safety, functional safety, mechanical safety, and chemical safety. This would be regulations for Europe. And again, in Europe, for toy drones, there are different regulations because certain drones fall under the toy directive. But if you look at US, there is not a real differentiation whether it is a toy or consumer drone. Basically, it's made based on the differentiation, based on the grant or based on the zones, which Jeff is going to tell you more about later. So with that, I leave the word to Jeff.
All right. Let's begin with aviation law. The Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, chartered the Micro Unmanned Aircraft Systems Aviation Rulemaking Committee, or ARC for short, to provide recommendations to the FAA administrator on a regulatory framework for classification and operation of micro UASs. This committee drafted its report and recommendations, and they were published in February of 2015. After further review, the FAA decided that additional engagement from the industry stakeholders was needed prior to addressing regulation. The objective was to create a performance-based standard that would result in the enforceable ruling. On June 21st, 2016, the FAA announced that they had released Part 107 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or the Small UAS Rule. This new rule, which takes effect in late August, will streamline the process for commercial drone operators to get the appropriate certifications while dropping the requirement that commercial UAV operators have manned aircraft pilot's license. On June 21, 2016, the FAA released Part 107, the Small UAS Rule. This rule, in its first iteration, was adopted to govern operational use of commercial drones in U.S. airspace. Some elements of this ruling are Part 107 applies to UAS weighing less than 55 pounds or 25 kilograms. Maximum altitude is 400 feet. Remote PICs, or pilots in command, must be at least 16 years of age, and permission be obtained from air traffic control prior to UAS use within Class B, C, D, and E airspaces. Additional specifics of this process shall be forthcoming in the weeks ahead. A Category 1, or UAS. A UAS operating as Category 1 may operate over people provided that it is equal to or less than 250 grams in weight. It must be labeled on its packaging with its actual weight, or a statement that the UAS weighs 250 grams or less, or this information must be declared to the FAA in an acceptable form and manner. Beyond this, there is no other requirements for Category 1. A Category 2, 3, or 4 small UAS may operate over people if it does not exceed the impact energy threshold specified for each category. To demonstrate this, the UAS manufacturer must declare the UAS meets the category-specific standards. Declaration must be submitted to the FAA, and the UAV must be labeled according to the standards and provide an operating manual that includes instructions for operation over people. Each operator shall be responsible for knowing what category of operations his or her UAS qualifies for and what operational limits must be followed. Category 1 performance standards. The ARC believed that the small UAS defined for use in this category would pose a level of risk that is so low that they are relatively safe to operate over people without being subjected to regulation beyond that proposed within Part 107. The low-risk performance standard for Category 1 was derived from the utilization of a weight-based measure rather than an impact kinetic energy measure. The human injury threshold acceptable to those people attending sports events where moving balls and other objects were considered as correlation for acceptance of the risk level probable during a Category 1 UAS failure. Additionally, it was determined that unlike a ball, a UAS on impact would deflect and tumble, resulting in only an average 38% kinetic energy transfer, therefore exhibiting a significantly lower expected severity of injury as compared to shrapnel impacts experienced in studies of ordnance explosions. Using this information and other resultant data, the ARC determined that the 80 joule limit of kinetic energy as a threshold of measure was acceptable to limit potential lethality. The 80 joule threshold and some assumptions were used by the ARC to calculate a weight threshold of 250 grams for registration. To demonstrate and support this decision, the ARC recommended that the UAS be labeled with either the actual weight or a general statement of it weighing 250 grams, or declare this information to the FAA in a form and manner acceptable to the FAA. Therefore, with the low risk of injury associated with Category 1 UAS, the ARC recommended no operational restrictions be applied. Now let's discuss Category 2. Under a Category 2 UAS, you may operate over people if the manufacturer certifies that the UAS, when failed, does not exceed the threshold of impact energy and complies with the performance standards as previously stated. Additionally, the operator or PIC, remote pilot and control, must comply with the instruction manual and maintain set-off distances of 20 feet above persons' heads, 10 feet laterally, and may not operate close enough to create any undue hazard to those persons. For a Category 2 UAS weighing more than 250 grams, the additional science, math, and logic used to present a 1% or less chance of serious injury to a person in the event of an impact was derived. This calculation, supported by Canadian and space industry data, resulted in the kinetic energy threshold of 12 joules per centimeter squared. And with that, a quadcopter UAS weighing in the range of 4 to 5 pounds would qualify, considering its design and operating instructions. As a result, the ARC recommended the FAA use this impact energy threshold for the proposed flight over people ruling. In order to support the consensus of the risk associated with impact scenarios of a Category 2 UAS, the ARC recommended that a test to measure the likely impact energies of an event be established. The impact exposed rotating parts were also to be considered, as well as the operator's instructions. Additionally, the labeling of the product was to address a defined form in which to declare compliance to the standard. To demonstrate compliance for Category 2, the manufacturer of the UAS is required to declare the small UAS meets applicable industry consensus performance standards for operation over people, submit that declaration to the FAA in a form and manner acceptable to the FAA, and label the product or retail packaging in accordance with the industry consensus standards. For a Category 2 UAS that exceeds the 250-gram weight, the following restrictions are mandated. The operator must comply with the manufacturer's operator manual for the small UAS developed in accordance with the industry consensus standards. The small UAS must also be operated at a minimum distance of 20 feet above people's heads or 10 feet laterally away from people. Notwithstanding these minimum distances requirements, the small UAS must also maintain a safe distance from people so as not to create an undue hazard to those people. Now let's discuss Category 3. The Category 3 UAS may operate over people if the manufacturer can certify in most probable failures that the impact energy threshold established will not be exceeded. Additionally, flying over crowds or dense populations of people is never permitted. A Category 3 UAS may only operate over people if the flight is over a closed or restricted work site, or the persons at which the overflight is limited to are incidental to the operation, as well as the performance standards of Category 2 being applicable to the UAS. The performance standards for Category 3 define the performance and operation restrictions for limited operations over people for a UAS that presents a level of risk of serious injury, AIS Level 3 or greater, that is incrementally higher than the level of risk injury presented in Category 2. Specifically, the ARC recommends that a small UAS be permitted to conduct limited operations over people if that UAS presents a 30% or lower chance of causing an AIS Level 3 or greater upon impact with a person. This too is derived using the joules over centimeter square calculation. To qualify for Category 3 operations, the manufacturer must certify that the UAS does not, in the most probable failure modes, exceed the typical or likely impact energy threshold as determined by industry consensus standard testing. The operator of the small UAS will also be subject to certain operational restrictions. To comply with consensus standards, the ARC recommended that a UAS that qualifies for Category 3 operations over people must establish a test to measure typical or likely impact energy of the small unmanned aircraft when the aircraft is operating in the most probable failure mode, to determine whether it meets the specified impact energy threshold. Testing may be subject to manufacturer-defined operating limitations. The impact energy threshold used in the standards may account for the energy dissipation caused by the physical design of the small unmanned aircraft and likely impact scenarios. It must also address the impact of exposed rotating parts to safety analysis with a focus on serious injury, an AIS level 3 or greater. It must be required of the manufacturer of the small unmanned aircraft to provide an operating manual to the operator, which must include operator requirements for flight over people. They must also define how the product shall be labeled to show operators that the manufacturer has declared that the UAS is in compliance with the standard. In addition, operations in this category allow limited operations over people and do not allow flight over crowds or dense gatherings of people. To qualify for a Category 3, a UAS, per the ARC, are required to declare the small UAS meets applicable industry consensus standards for operation over people. It must submit that declaration to the FAA in a form and manner acceptable to the FAA, and label the product or product retail packaging in accordance with industry consensus standards. Category 3 operational restrictions are the same as Category 2 in regards to flight over people, such as comply with operator's manual and maintain safe offset distances in order to mitigate the higher risk level associated with Category 3. The ARC also recommended the following restrictions. Flights over crowds or dense concentrations of people is never permitted. The Category 3 UAS may only operate over people if the operation is conducted over a closed or restricted access work site with the permission of the site's owner or operator, or overflight of people is limited to those who are transient or incidental to the operation, such as the overflight of people is incidental to the operation and not sustained. Category 4. A Category 4 UAS allows for operation over people, including crowds and dense populations, provided the manufacturer certifies the impact energy of a probable failure does not exceed the standard threshold. In addition to complying to the performance standards, the UAS must comply to a documented risk mitigation plan developed and adopted in accordance with consensus standards. The performance and operation standards applicable to Category 2 UASs also apply to Category 4 UASs. The performance standards or specifics of a Category 4 UAS operation mirror that of a Category 3 UAS operation, with the exception being that no operational limitations exist as a result of risk mitigation plan specific to the operations is mandated. This plan should include coordination with the FAA, event sponsors, local law enforcement, and the PIC or remote pilot and control training commensurate with the defined increased risk as determined by consensus standards. The performance standards of a Category 4 UAS are all that of a Category 3 plus a required risk mitigation plan inclusive of interface with appropriate authorities such as the FAA, local police, and event coordinators. The UAS construction and material makeup should also be considered to ensure no additional potential risk of injury to people or property may be caused by the impact. A Category 4 UAS can assure compliance for operations over people by declaring that the small UAS meets applicable industry consensus standards for operation over people, by submitting that declaration to the FAA in a form and manner acceptable to the FAA, and labeling the product or product retail packaging in accordance with industry consensus standards. In addition to those restrictions listed for Category 2 and 3 UAS operators, Category 4 operators would be required to prepare risk mitigation plans in accordance with consensus standards and coordinate operations with authorities having jurisdiction, such as event planners, local law enforcement, and/or FAA. In summary, what are the weight or impact energy thresholds for operations under each UAS category? For Category 1, the UAS must weigh 250 grams or less. For Category 2, the UAS must cause less than a 1% chance of AIS Level 3 or greater injury as expressed in the rule by not exceeding an impact energy threshold defined by the FAA in the joules over centimeter square calculation. In Category 3, the UAS can cause no more than a 30% chance of AIS Level 3 or greater injury as expressed in the rule by not exceeding an impact energy threshold defined by the calculation joules over centimeter squared. The Category 4 UAS can cause less than a 30% chance of AIS Level 3 or greater injury as expressed in the rule by not exceeding an impact energy threshold defined by the joules over centimeter squared. What are the industry consensus performance standards associated with each UAS category of operation? For Category 1, there are none, but the ARC recommends that the FAA invite industry to develop voluntary consensus standards for future. Category 2, there are performance restrictions or standards. The industry consensus standard must, at a minimum, establish a test to measure the typical impact energy of the unmanned aircraft to determine whether it meets the specified impact energy threshold. And secondly, the study of impact of exposed rotating parts to safety analysis. And thirdly, require the manufacturer of the unmanned aircraft to provide an operating manual to the operator. In Category 3, the industry consensus standard must establish a test to measure the typical impact energy of the unmanned aircraft, address impact of exposed rotating parts to safety analysis, and thirdly, require the manufacturer of the unmanned aircraft to provide an operating manual to the operator. In Category 4 is the same as 2 and 3, with the addition of consider materials and operator components of the UAS to determine materials pose risk of collateral injury to people on the ground, and develop risk mitigation plans for operations over people. What are the labeling requirements for each category? Category 1, label the product retail packaging with the actual weight of the unmanned aircraft, or with a general statement that the unmanned aircraft weighs 250 grams or less. Or declare that unmanned aircraft weighs 250 grams or less and submit that declaration to the FAA in a form and manner acceptable to the FAA. Category 2, declare the UAS meets applicable industry consensus standards for operation over people. Submit that declaration to the FAA in a form and manner acceptable to the FAA, and label the product and or product retail packaging in accordance with industry consensus standards. For Category 3, declare the UAS meets applicable consensus standards for operation over people. Secondly, submit that declaration to the FAA in a form and manner acceptable to the FAA, and label the product and or product retail packaging in accordance with industry consensus standards. For Category 4, declare that the UAS meets the applicable industry consensus standards for operation over people. Submit that declaration to the FAA in a form and manner acceptable to the FAA. Label the product and or product retail packaging in accordance with industry consensus standards. Are there any additional operational requirements beyond those imposed by the proposed Part 107 required for each category? For Category 1, no. For Category 2, yes. The operator must comply with the manufacturer's operator manual. The operator must also ensure that the UAS maintains a minimum distance of 20 feet above people's heads or 10 feet laterally away from people on the ground, and must not create an undue hazard to people. Thirdly, yes, flight over crowds or dense concentrations of people is never permitted under Category 3. In addition to that restriction, small UAS may operate over people only if the operation is conducted over a closed or restricted access work site with the permission of the site's owner or operator, or overflight of people is limited to those who are transient or incidental to the operation. The overflight of people is incidental to the operation and is not sustained. Operational requirements applicable to Category 2 comply with the manufacturer's operator manual, maintain specific minimum set-off distances, also apply to Category 3. And Category 4, in addition to the operational requirements for Category 2, the UAS may only operate over people if the operation is conducted in compliance with a documentation or a documented risk mitigation plan, which may include, among other things, local coordination with pilot training commensurate with the risk, and which was adopted in accordance with industry consensus standards. To ensure compliance of UAVs to the proposed ARC recommendations, the following TÜVSÜD testing services are available worldwide: electrical safety testing, battery safety testing, functional safety testing, environmental testing, mechanical safety testing, chemical safety testing, and wireless testing.
So thank you for your time today, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day ahead. Thank you.